Her parents were killed, her sister raped and beaten to death, and Vanessa Bennett was nearly killed as well, leaving her to spend a lifetime wondering, why did she survive?
I was hit and hammer. My skull kind of breaks right here. My jaw pretty much is shattered. I had a tracheotomy here. I have a shattered pelvis. But I guess I healed pretty well.
On the morning of January 16, 1984, in a quiet suburb of Aurora, Colorado, firefighters walked into a house and found something almost none of them would ever be able to forget. Inside that home was a family of four: a young father, 27 years old, a young mother, 26, and their two little girls. One of them was 7, the other was 3. By the time help arrived, most of that family was already gone, taken in the night, in their own beds, in the one place on earth where they should have been safest. But there was one small sound in that house, faint, almost missed, because against every odd, one of them was still alive. The 3-year-old, the baby of the family. She had been gravely hurt and left behind, hidden in her own bedroom, so badly injured that she was barely breathing. Her name was Vanessa, and she survived. She would grow up with no memory of the family she lost that night, no memory of her mother's voice, or her father's face, or the big sister she shared a room with. She would grow up as the single living witness to one of the most horrifying crimes in Colorado history, unable to remember a single moment of it. And she would grow up with a question that had no answer. Who did this? Who walked into her family's home that night and took everyone she loved and left her for dead? For 34 years, no one could tell her. This is the story of the Bennett family, of the little girl who lived, of the grandmother who never stopped waiting, and of the night, decades later, when a single answer finally came out of the one place no one was looking. But before any of that, before the horror, before the wait, this was simply a family. So, that is where we have to begin. In 1984, the Bennetts were the kind of young family you wouldn't look at twice, because there was nothing to worry about. And that is exactly what makes their story so hard. Bruce Bennett was 27 years old. His wife Deborah was 26. They were young. They were building a life, the way you do in your 20s, one ordinary day at a time. They lived in a comfortable home in Aurora, Colorado, a growing suburb on the eastern edge of Denver. The kind of neighborhood people moved to precisely because it felt safe. Quiet streets, other young families. Nothing ever happened there. Bruce and Deborah both worked at a family furniture business, one run by Bruce's uncle. They were dependable people, the kind who showed up. Remember that. It matters later. And they had 2 daughters. The older girl was Melissa. She was 7 years old, a second grader, right in the middle of that bright, funny age where a child is becoming a whole person, full of opinions and jokes and plans. The younger girl was Vanessa. She was 3. Still a baby, really. The little sister. The 2 of them shared a bedroom, the way sisters do, with their beds in the same room and a whole private world between them. That was the Bennett family, a young mom and dad in their 20s, 2 little girls, a house in the suburbs, jobs at the family business, an ordinary, hopeful, unremarkable American family. The kind of family whose story should have been long and quiet and full of nothing worth reporting. Now I want to take you to a specific night. Because to understand what was lost, you have to see them as they really were, on one of the last ordinary evenings of their lives. It was a Sunday, the 15th of January, 1984. And that weekend, the Bennett family had a reason to celebrate. Because little Melissa, the 7-year-old, had a birthday. So that is how the family spent that last evening together. Not in fear, not in any kind of shadow. They were out, celebrating a 7-year-old's birthday. A mom and a dad and their 2 little girls doing one of the happiest, most ordinary things a family ever does. A birthday. A tired, happy little girl at the center of it all. And late that night, they came home. Together. Safe. All 4 of them. Back inside their own house, where nothing bad was supposed to be able to reach them. There was just one small thing. Earlier, Bruce's mother, a woman named Connie, had reminded her son to do something simple, to shut the garage door. It was the kind of thing a mother says, an ordinary, almost automatic reminder. Lock up, shut the door, be safe. And on that particular night, after a long, happy day, coming home late with 2 tired children, the garage door was left open. That is not a detail I share to place blame. God. No, it is the opposite. I share it because it is the most human thing in the world, to come home exhausted and happy and forget one small thing. Every single one of us has left a door unlocked. Every one of us has forgotten to do the small, safe thing 100 times, and nothing ever came of it. But that is the quiet, terrible heart of this story. That the difference between an ordinary life and an unthinkable tragedy can be something as small, as innocent, as forgettable as a garage door left open on the night of a child's birthday. The Bennett family went to sleep that night, a mother and a father, a birthday girl, and her little sister. They had no reason in the world to think they wouldn't all wake up in the morning. Sometime in the dark hours after the Bennetts fell asleep, a man came in through that open garage. He did not know them. There was no connection, no grudge, no reason. He was a stranger, moving through a sleeping family's home. He had brought a weapon with him, a hammer. And at some point, he took a second one, a knife, from the family's own kitchen. And then he attacked them, one by one, in their beds. Bruce, the father, woke up. And that matters. Bruce Bennett woke up, and he understood that there was someone in his home, and that his wife and his daughters were in danger. And he did what a father does. He fought. He did not hide, and he did not run. He threw himself at a stranger in the dark to try to protect his family. The evidence of that fight was still there for investigators to find. Decades later, Bruce Bennett died near the bottom of his own stairs, fighting for the people he loved. He could not stop what happened, but he tried, with everything he had. And Vanessa, all these years later, deserves to know that her father fought for her. Deborah was killed in the bedroom. Melissa, the 7-year-old birthday girl, was killed in the room she shared with her sister. And here I will say the hardest thing once, because the truth requires it, and then I will leave it be. Both little girls were harmed in ways no child should ever be harmed. Melissa did not survive. And then there was Vanessa, 3 years old. She was gravely hurt, and she was left for dead, but she did not die. Somewhere in that room, tucked between her bed and the wall, the baby of the family was still, impossibly, alive. The man took his hammer and left. He fled into the night. On his way, he discarded the kitchen knife outside, in the snow. And then he was simply gone, as if he had never been there at all, leaving behind a destroyed family and no answers. Now, the morning. It was Monday, January 16th, and that day, Bruce and Deborah Bennett did not show up for work. For most people, being late for work is nothing. But remember, the Bennetts were dependable. They showed up. So when the young couple didn't arrive at the family furniture business, and didn't call, a secretary phoned Bruce's mother, Connie. Connie tried to reach them. She called the house. No one answered. And a cold, rising worry took hold of her. The kind every parent knows, the fear you try to talk yourself out of. She got in her car, and she drove to her son's home. And Connie Bennett was the one who walked inside. Connie was the one who found them. There are no words I can offer for what that mother experienced in those moments, and I am not going to try to invent any. She would later describe finding her son. She said, and I quote, "I fell on my knees, and I asked him, 'Bruce, what happened?' And he couldn't respond." But in the middle of that unimaginable horror, Connie Bennett did the thing that changed everything. She called for help. She called 911. And because she made that call, when the firefighters arrived, they found what no one expected to find in that house, a survivor. They found 3-year-old Vanessa, barely alive. And they got her out, and they got her help, in time. Connie Bennett had walked into the worst moment of her entire life, and in it, without knowing it, she saved her granddaughter's life, the only piece of her son's family that could still be saved. Vanessa lived because her grandmother came looking. I need to pause for just a moment, and I'll keep it short, because this story deserves your full attention. If you believe these victims deserve to be remembered with care, and not turned into something ugly, then this channel is for you. That's the only way we tell these stories here. From the real records, with the people at the center. If that matters to you, please subscribe. It genuinely helps. And if you can, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It means a lot to know who's out there. Now, let's stay with Vanessa, because her story is far from over. Vanessa Bennett survived, but survival, in a case like this, is its own long and complicated road. She was 3 years old. She had lost her mother, her father, and her big sister, all in a single night. And she herself had been gravely injured, hurt in ways that would follow her for the rest of her life. She would grow up carrying the physical marks of that night, and a brain injury that never fully healed. But here is the thing that is almost impossible to comprehend. Vanessa doesn't remember any of it. She was too young. The memories never formed, or did not survive. She would grow up with no memory of the attack, which is a mercy. But also, no memory of the family she lost, which is a particular kind of grief, all its own. She could not picture her mother's face. She could not recall her father's voice, or a single afternoon with the big sister she shared a room with. Years later, as an adult, when she tried to reach back for anything at all, what she found were only fragments, the faintest impressions of the house. She remembered something about Christmas. A staircase. The layout of the upstairs. The bedrooms. Hers and her sister's on one side, her parents on the other. Little architectural ghosts. But of the people, of the family itself, there was almost nothing. That is its own kind of loss. Vanessa didn't just lose her family. She lost even the memory of having had one. She had to grow up and be told who her own parents were. She had to learn her own mother and father the way you learn a history lesson, from other people's stories and old photographs, because she had no memories of her own to hold. She was raised by her extended family, who loved her. Her grandmother, Connie, the woman who found the family and saved her, remained a constant. Vanessa grew up. She built a life. She eventually moved to Arizona. She carried on, the way survivors do, not because it was easy, but because there was no other choice. But over all of it, over her entire childhood and her entire young adulthood, hung that one enormous, unanswered question. Who did this? Who had walked through that open garage door? Who was the stranger who destroyed her family that night? He had no name. He had no face. He was just an absence, a hole at the center of her life, a person who had done the worst thing imaginable and then simply vanished into the world, unpunished and unknown. And it was not only Vanessa's question, it was Connie's. It belonged to everyone who had loved Bruce and Deborah and Melissa, and it belonged, in a way, to the whole city. Because at the time, this crime terrified Denver. A family, slaughtered in their own suburban home, in the night, by a stranger, for no reason anyone could find. If it could happen to the Bennetts, in that safe, quiet neighborhood, it could happen to anyone. People locked their doors differently after that, checked their windows, lay awake listening to the sounds of their own houses. A killer had come in from the dark and vanished back into it, and no one knew who he was, or whether he would come back. And as the investigation ground on, that fear only deepened, because police began to realize that the Bennett family had not been the only ones. Here is what investigators were up against. Because the Bennett murders, as it turned out, were not the beginning, and they were not the end. As detectives worked the scene, they started to see something that made the fear so much worse. This had not been a single, isolated night of horror. It was part of a spree. In a span of just under 2 weeks, in January of 1984, a wave of brutal attacks struck the Denver area. Different people, different homes, but the same chilling signature every time. A stranger, a home invasion in the dark, a hammer. 6 days before the Bennetts, a woman named Patricia Louise Smith, 50 years old, an interior decorator, was attacked and killed in her home in Lakewood. There were others. A woman in Aurora, attacked in her home and left for dead, who survived. A couple, attacked in their own bedroom. For roughly 12 days, someone moved through the Denver metro area doing the unthinkable, again and again, and then simply stopped. And that was the terrifying part. He stopped. The attacks ended, the trail went cold, and the man who had done all of this just evaporated. No final crime to catch him on. No mistake that gave him away. He walked out of that killing spree and into thin air, and the city was left waiting for a knock in the night that, mercifully, never came again. But mercy is not the same as justice. Because the man was still out there, and the people who loved the Bennetts had to live with that. Investigators had crime scenes, they had evidence. What they did not have, in 1984, was any way to turn that evidence into a name. They worked a composite sketch. It generated leads. Every one of them dissolved into nothing. And slowly, agonizingly, the case slid into that worst of all states. Not closed. Never closed. Just cold. A file that detectives kept pulling back out and kept putting back unsolved. Years passed, then a decade, then two, and Connie Bennett grew older inside that silence, carrying the loss of her son, his wife, and her granddaughter, and the unbearable open question of who had done it. Vanessa grew from a little girl into a young woman, always knowing that the man responsible for the defining wound of her life was out there somewhere, with a name, with a face. Living an ordinary life, going to sleep at night, while her family lay in the ground. But here is what none of them knew. The whole time they were waiting, the killer had already made a mistake. He just didn't know it yet, and neither did they. Because on those nights in 1984, he had left something of himself behind, his DNA. In 1984, that meant almost nothing. The technology to use it did not exist in any real way. So it sat there, in an evidence locker, a silent, coded message from the killer to a future that had not arrived yet, waiting for the world to invent a way to read it. And year by year, the world did. In 2002, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation did something impossible by the standards of the original investigation. They took the DNA from the Bennett murders and they compared it to the DNA from the Patricia Smith killing in Lakewood. It was a match. The same man. Now proven, by his own biology, to have done both. For a moment, it must have felt like the break of a lifetime. They had him. They had his unique genetic fingerprint, the one thing in the universe that belonged to no one else on Earth. And then they ran straight into the wall that would hold for another 16 years. Because a genetic fingerprint is only useful if you have something to compare it against, you match the DNA from the scene to a person in a database. But when investigators searched, the killer was not in any database. Anywhere. His profile matched nothing, because he had never been entered into the system. Think about how maddening that is. They were holding the answer in their hands. Complete, unique, absolutely certain. The identity of the man who murdered the Bennett family existed, physically, in a lab, and it was useless, because it pointed to a man with no name. They had everything about him, except the one thing they needed. So the answer went back into the dark to wait some more. Not for better science this time. The science was ready. It was waiting for something much simpler and much harder to force. It was waiting for the killer himself to slip up. To finally, somewhere, for some reason, be entered into the system. And what none of them knew, through all those years of searching and waiting, was where he had been the entire time. Before we get to the moment everything changed, let me ask you something, because I genuinely want to know what you think. This family waited 34 years. A grandmother, a survivor, everyone who loved them. 34 years, not even knowing who they were waiting for. That kind of patience, that kind of endurance, is almost beyond imagining. What does it stir in you? Tell me in the comments. And if this story is holding you, please take a second to subscribe. It's the best way to make sure the next one finds you. Now, let's find out how they finally caught him. For 34 years, the man who destroyed the Bennett family had a genetic identity but no name. He was a ghost in a database. But here is what that ghost had actually been doing during those decades. He had not escaped justice entirely. He had simply been paying for different crimes, under his own name, in another state, the entire time. His name was Alex Christopher Ewing. And in 1984, the same year he moved through Colorado, in that 12-day spree, Ewing had left the state. Later that year, he attacked a couple in their bedroom in Henderson, Nevada, near Las Vegas, with an axe handle. For that crime, he was caught. He was convicted. And in 1985, he was sent to a Nevada prison to serve a sentence of 110 years. Consider the strange, terrible irony of that. The man Colorado had been hunting for decades, the ghost with no name, had been locked in a prison cell in Nevada almost the entire time. He had been caught in 1985. He was never free. During those long years of silence, he was right there, in custody, under his own name. The system had him. It just had never connected the man in the Nevada cell to the unknown DNA from the Colorado murders. Two facts about the same man, sitting in two different states, that had simply never been introduced to each other. And then, in 2018, they finally were. The reason was almost mundane, which is often how these things break. Nevada, like many states, had policies about collecting DNA from its prison inmates. And in 2018, Alex Ewing was required to submit a DNA sample. His genetic profile, for the first time, was entered into the National FBI database, the same national system that holds crime scene DNA from across the country. For 34 years, the Bennett killer's DNA had been sitting in that system, from the Colorado side, waiting. An unknown male, linked to a family's murder, with no name. And now, from a prison in Nevada, the other half of the equation was finally entered. It took one day. The very next day after Ewing's DNA went into the system, investigators with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation got the hit. The unknown male from the 1984 Bennett murders and the Patricia Smith murder finally had a name. After 34 years of silence, the match came back in a single day, because the answer had been sitting in a prison cell the whole time, just waiting for someone to enter it into the right computer. Alex Christopher Ewing. I want to be precise about how this case was actually solved, because it matters, and because a lot of retellings get it wrong. This was not solved by the kind of family tree genetic genealogy that has cracked so many other cold cases. It was simpler, and in a way more damning than that. It was a direct match. The killer's own DNA finally entered into the national database, matching the killer's own DNA left at the scene. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. It just needed Alex Ewing to finally be put into it. The ghost had a name. And now, the state of Colorado intended to make him answer for it. Ewing, from his Nevada prison cell, fought hard against being brought back to Colorado. He did not want to face what was waiting for him. He filed motions. He appealed. But the Nevada Supreme Court ultimately denied him, and Alex Ewing was extradited back to Colorado to stand trial, at last, for what he had done on those January nights in 1984. For Connie Bennett, now in her 80s, and for Vanessa, now a grown woman, the impossible was finally happening. After 34 years, the question that had defined their lives was going to be answered in a courtroom. The stranger from the dark finally had a name and a face, and they were going to have to look at him. The trial of Alex Ewing for the murders of the Bennett family began in the summer of 2021 in Arapahoe County, Colorado, 37 years after that night. The case was prosecuted by the district attorney, John Kellner, and the evidence against Ewing was overwhelming because it was, at its core, his own body. His DNA matched to the genetic material the killer had left behind in 1984. Ewing's defense did not really try to argue that the crime hadn't been horrific. They couldn't. In fact, one of his own defense attorneys said something in court that stayed with a lot of people. He acknowledged plainly that what Connie Bennett had suffered was something no mother should ever have to endure, and that what Vanessa Bennett had suffered was something no person should ever have to endure. The horror was not in dispute. Instead, the defense tried to raise doubt about the DNA, about whether they had truly identified the right man. The jury did not find it convincing. I want to tell you about one moment from that trial, because it captures something important about how this case was handled, and about the difference between justice and spectacle. At one point, the prosecution needed to show the jury video from the crime scene. It was, by every account, almost unbearable to witness, and so the prosecutors made a specific request. They asked that the video not be displayed on the large screens in the courtroom, the ones the whole gallery could see. Instead, it was shown on a small monitor, positioned so that only the jury, who needed to see it to do their duty, actually saw it. And Connie Bennett, the grandmother, who was sitting right there in the courtroom, was seated so that she would not have to see it at all. Even in that courtroom, in the middle of a murder trial, people went out of their way to protect this family from more pain than they had already endured. That is the standard this story deserves. And it is the standard I have tried to hold to in telling it to you. The most powerful witness in that courtroom was Vanessa herself. She was 41 years old now. She had traveled from her home in Arizona to be there. She took the stand, the 3-year-old who had survived, now a grown woman, and she faced the reality of her own family's murder. The prosecutor asked her, gently, whether she had any memory of being attacked that night. She did not. She had only those same faint fragments of the house. She had spent her whole life as the sole survivor of a crime she could not remember, carrying an injury she never asked for, from an event that had erased her entire family before she was old enough to know them. The defense, when their turn came to question her, asked her nothing. What, really, was there to ask? On the 6th of August, 2021, after about 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Guilty, on all counts. After 37 years, Alex Christopher Ewing was formally, legally, and permanently branded as the man who murdered Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett. Days later came the sentencing. And the judge, a man named Darren Valle, did not hold back. He told Ewing that in a quarter-century of practicing law, these were the worst crimes he had ever seen. He described what Ewing had done across those 12 days in 1984 as an unspeakable orgy of violence, and he handed down the only sentence that fit: 3 consecutive life sentences. 1 for Bruce, 1 for Deborah, 1 for Melissa. Ewing would die in prison, with no possibility of ever getting out. Members of the family spoke that day, and Vanessa, the little girl who lived, stood up as a grown woman and put words to what had been taken from her. She said, and I quote, "I'm sure my parents and sister were great people, but it's unfortunate I don't remember anything about them. I didn't just lose my parents and sister, I lost my trust in people." There is a lifetime of grief in that sentence. The grief not just of losing a family, but of never getting to know the family you lost. And her grandmother, Connie, who had waited 37 years, who had found them, who had saved Vanessa, spoke too. She had one word for what the DNA had finally done. She called it, simply, a marvelous thing. And then, in the same breath, with the hard honesty of someone who has lived a long time inside a loss, she said what every family in her position knows to be true. "It's not closure," she said. "There is no such thing. There is only, at last, an answer." Alex Ewing will spend the rest of his life in prison. He was later also convicted of the murder of Patricia Smith, the woman in Lakewood. He is exactly where he should be, and he will never leave. That is justice, as much as justice is possible here. But I don't want to leave you thinking about him, because this was never his story. He was the intruder, the stranger, the absence. He does not deserve to be the last thing you remember. This was the story of the Bennett family. Of Bruce, a 27-year-old father who woke in the dark and fought a stranger with his bare hands to try to save the people he loved. Who did not succeed, but who tried, with everything he had. Let that be how he is remembered, not as a victim, as a father who fought. Of Deborah, 26, a young mother building a life with her husband and her 2 little girls in a house that was supposed to be safe. Of Melissa, 7 years old, whose last full day was her own birthday. A little girl who was celebrated and loved, and who should have had 80 more birthdays after that one. And of Vanessa, 3 years old that night. The baby wedged between the bed and the wall, so nearly gone, who somehow held on, who grew up without a single memory of the people she was grieving, who carried an injury and a loss most of us cannot imagine for her entire life. And who, at 41 years old, walked into a courtroom and faced it all, and stood as living proof that the man in the dark did not get to have the final word. Because he didn't. He wanted to erase that family. And he failed. He failed because a 3-year-old refused to die. He failed because a grandmother came looking and made a phone call and saved her. He failed because that grandmother waited 34 years and never let go. And he failed because, in the end, his own body gave him up, and the little girl he left for dead grew up to watch him be led away in chains. Vanessa Bennett is alive. She is the last of her family, and she is living proof of them. Every day she wakes up is a day the man in the dark did not win. Bruce, Deborah, Melissa, and Vanessa, who lived. Remember them. Not for how their story nearly ended, but for the family they were, and for the one of them who is still here. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. I tell these the same way every time. Carefully, from the real records, with the victims at the center, always. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.